By 1876, the Japanese government had quietly converted the rice stipends of an estimated 400,000 former samurai into government bonds, some paying as little as 5% per year. For men whose families had received guaranteed income for generations, this was not a reform. It was a financial reckoning. For most of the world, the story of the samurai ends with a sword meeting a rifle. The image is clean and satisfying, an ancient warrior class loyal to a dying code, overcome by industrial modernity. It is the kind of narrative that makes history feel inevitable, and that is precisely why it deserves a closer look. The myth persists because it contains a kernel of truth. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, did introduce conscription, centralized command, and a modern national army. These changes genuinely undermined the samurai's military role. But the story of how an entire class, educated, armed, and politically connected, unraveled within less than a decade requires more than technology to explain. Cultures do not dissolve simply because new tools arrive. What dismantles them far more efficiently is the erosion of their economic foundation. To understand why the popular narrative took hold, we need to understand what the samurai actually were before 1868. They were not merely warriors. For nearly 3 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai had functioned as a hereditary administrative and military class, receiving stipends, called roku, paid in rice by the domains they served. These were not wages tied to performance. They were inherited entitlements bound to social rank, passed from father to son, enshrined in law and custom since the early 17th century. This arrangement made the samurai deeply dependent on a system that, for most of the Edo period, was remarkably stable. Rice was currency, status, and survival. The samurai understood their world through that framework. When it was abruptly replaced by something entirely different, paper instruments, interest rates, bond markets, the consequences were not abstract. They were severe. The first sign of structural weakness had appeared long before 1868. Decades of peace under the Tokugawa order had made the samurai's military skills largely redundant, while the cost of maintaining samurai status, appropriate housing, clothing, education, and social obligations had remained constant. By the mid-19th century, many lower-ranking samurai were quietly borrowing from urban merchants, pledging future stipend payments to cover present expenses. The reformers of the Meiji era did not create this financial fragility. They inherited it, and then accelerated it with considerable speed and effect. In 1869, the new Meiji government began its first serious attempt to address the stipend burden. The fiscal pressure was significant. By some estimates, the government was directing roughly 1/3 of its total revenues to support the former samurai class. This was incompatible with the ambitions of a state determined to fund railways, build a modern military, and compete with industrialized Western powers. But eliminating the stipend system all at once was politically dangerous. The government moved in stages. By 1871, the traditional feudal domains, the Han, were dissolved and absorbed into modern administrative prefectures under central government control. This was the structural change that mattered most. The lords who had paid samurai stipends for centuries were folded into the new state. Responsibility for those payments transferred to the national government. And the national government had options that feudal lords had never possessed. It had access to a modern financial system. Between 1871 and 1873, the government introduced a series of voluntary commutation policies, offering samurai the option to exchange their hereditary stipends for a single payment in government bonds. The bond values were calculated from years of stipend history, and the interest rates were presented as reasonable. But voluntary take-up was limited. Most samurai did not fully grasp what they were being offered, or what they would be losing. In 1876, the government removed the choice entirely. Commutation became mandatory. Every former samurai would receive a government bond in exchange for their hereditary income. The stipend system ended by decree overnight. This is the point where the economics become decisive. The bonds issued to former samurai carried interest rates that varied significantly by rank. According to historical accounts of the commutation, higher-ranking samurai received rates of around 10 to 14% annually. lower-ranking samurai, who formed the vast majority of the class and had the fewest economic reserves, received the worst terms, often 5 or 6%. For many, the annual income from the bond was already less than their previous stipend had been. But the deeper problem was inflation. Japan in the 1870s was experiencing significant monetary instability. The Meiji government had financed its early years partly through large-scale paper currency issuance, and prices were rising. A fixed bond payment that appeared adequate in 1876 was worth measurably less in purchasing power by 1878, and less still in 1880. Former samurai were not simply receiving lower income. They were receiving income whose real value was shrinking each year, paid in a form, paper bonds, that they had no tradition of managing and no institutional support for navigating. What followed was a pattern familiar to anyone who has studied forced asset transitions. Many samurai of lower rank, lacking capital reserves and financial literacy, faced immediate pressure to cover living expenses, food, housing, the cost of re-establishing themselves in a new occupation. They sold their bonds on the open market. As supply increased, bond prices fell, particularly for lower-grade issues. Those who sold early received close to face value. Those who waited received progressively less. Those who held on longest, hoping conditions would improve, frequently received the least of all. A class that had already been economically marginal for a generation was now being asked to navigate a modern capital market for the first time, without preparation, without guidance, and with a depreciating asset. The outcome was the product of structural misalignment. A new financial system introduced its speed into a population entirely unprepared for it. And it is worth pausing here, because this dynamic, an established class liquidating fixed income instruments under inflationary pressure, recurs in economic transitions across centuries. When productive assets are replaced with financial instruments that a population does not understand, in an environment where those instruments are losing real value, wealth tends to migrate. In Meiji Japan, it moved toward the merchants, financiers, and early industrialists who understood the new system and had the liquidity to take advantage of it. If this line of thinking is opening something for you, the idea that financial instruments can function as instruments of redistribution as much as instruments of growth, subscribe to Financial Origins and join a community that takes economic history seriously. By 1877, the financial position of the former samurai class had become acute across several regions of Japan. The southern domain of Satsuma, in Kyushu, was among the most severely affected. Satsuma had been one of the most powerful domains in pre-Meiji Japan, with a large and proud samurai population that had played a central role in the restoration itself. Many of these men had fought to bring the new government to power. Within a decade, they found themselves economically sidelined by it. The Satsuma Rebellion, which began in January 1877 under the leadership of Saigo Takamori, is most often described as a revolt in defense of samurai honor, tradition, and opposition to the rapid transformation of Japan. Saigo himself framed it in those terms: loyalty, virtue, the corruption of the new order. These were genuine grievances, but they coexisted with an equally concrete economic desperation. The men who followed Saigo were not simply idealists mourning a lost culture. Many were former samurai who had sold their bonds at a loss, failed to find stable employment in the new economy, and seen their families slide into poverty within a single generation. The rebellion drew on both wells. The Meiji government mobilized its new conscript army, ordinary citizens trained and armed with modern rifles, against a force of traditionally trained fighters. The campaign lasted 7 months. By September 1877, the government forces had prevailed. Saigo Takamori died at the final engagement at Shiroyama. It was the last significant organized resistance by the former samurai class, and it ended not with a negotiation, but with a military outcome that had, in many ways, already been shaped years earlier, through fiscal policy. The central point is not that the samurai were ultimately defeated in battle. It is the sequence. The military suppression of 1877 was the final act. The decisive transformation had taken place years before, through mandatory bond conversion, inflationary fiscal policy, and the structural inability of the affected class to adapt to an entirely new economic language. A class that had dominated Japanese society for centuries was rendered economically marginal before it ever became militarily irrelevant. The Satsuma Rebellion was not the cause of the samurai's end. It was a consequence of an end that had already been set in motion through financial policy. That distinction matters because it reframes the question we should be asking. The conventional version asks, how did a traditional society fail to survive the arrival of modernity? The more precise question asks, how did a new government systematically neutralize a powerful and potentially resistant elite using financial instruments without requiring direct military confrontation first? And the answer to that question is not unique to Japan in 1876. It recurs throughout economic history, in different forms, in different centuries. When states need to dismantle entrenched institutions, whether military classes, landed aristocracies, or established economic structures, open confrontation is expensive and uncertain. Financial transformation is slower, quieter, and considerably more effective. You do not need to defeat adversaries in the field if you can first render them economically insolvent. Replace durable assets with instruments they cannot manage, denominated in a currency losing real value, and time does the rest. The direction of wealth tends to follow. What the story of the Meiji samurai reveals is a recurring pattern in the history of institutional change. The samurai were not uniquely naive or uniquely vulnerable. They were a capable class caught inside a transition that produced a particular outcome: their economic pacification and eventual absorption into a new order on terms set by others. The narrative of the noble warrior class overcome by the march of progress is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. And incomplete accounts of how wealth and power change hands rarely survive by accident. They tend to persist because they simplify what was actually a complex and consequential process into something that looks, from a distance, like fate. Every major economic transition in history has been accompanied by a story that makes it seem inevitable. The more carefully you examine the mechanics underneath those stories, the more clearly you see who made the choices and who absorbed the costs. Leave a comment with what you found most unexpected, like the video, and subscribe to Financial Origins. The history of money is the history of power, and it is always worth understanding how that power moves.